The big thing going to the moratorium, it only gives a moratorium on customs duties for 5 years after adoption or after the agreement goes into force. So it's not a permanent moratorium.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
We're on for a great show for SimplyTrade podcast, and we are really looking forward to a good discussion today. We've got a couple of heavy-hitting type things that we're going to be talking about today, so we're going to get right into it here in just a second. But with that, I will say, I keep saying this over and over, almost like a broken record, but thank you again. Lalo and I are so appreciative of the show is hitting new levels as far as our expansion of our listenership. Y'all are great. Oh man, it's just fantastic. Hit that like button, hit the subscribe button or follow, whatever it is, because it really does help us in so many ways, I guess is the way to say it. Man, I'm stammering and stuttering. I it's like my elevator's just not making it all the way up this morning. Anyway, saying that, okay, Lalo, thank you so much for where you and I were both at the GTE conference recently and learning on some new things and all that. We were just in Chicago. And it's always great to do some public appearances and whatnot. But by the time we have recorded this, we would have been back a little ways, a few days. But, man, it was always good to get, you and I don't get to see each other in person very often. So it's always cool to do that.
It is. And we're also learning, I guess, because when we go, we actually hear, again, this show, everyone, was started because of the pandemic, eliminating what we actually go to these conferences for, which is to have those conversations in the hallways and the dining rooms, et cetera, and that is why this show was created to
listen to opinions on stuff of what's going on. And
well, yeah, because during the pandemic, we didn't have conferences anymore. So we didn't have those conversations, those went away, obviously. And so that's why I approached Andy and said, let's do that. Now we're having those conversations again in person, but we're also trying to duplicate that here on our show. So, really glad that you all are enjoying this and continue to enjoy this. But yes, thank you all for your support.
Well, with that, we are bringing on today a discussion regarding digital traffic, I guess, if you would call it, data flows and whatnot, and how governments are eyeing it, in my opinion, to try and hit some tax, generate revenue, I think. Or I may have it all screwed up. You know me. I mean, I'm dumb as a box of rocks. So we have Marianne Rowden on today, and Marianne used to be with AAEI. She's now with a e-commerce association. I'm going to let you say it because I'll butcher it up as far as the name on it. But also has been involved, in the industry for a while and whatnot. And so we're going to get to talk about, not only the recent moratorium on how governments are looking at, monitoring and tracking and taxing, I guess, digital traffic, but also we're going to have a little discussion on the minimis in the U.S. and some of the things that are going on there. But Marianne, welcome to the show. It's good seeing you online here.
Great to be back.
I wanted to make a quick mention also, is just because this is a little, not personal, but very close to us here at Global Training Center, is that we obviously provide training, and we're looking forward to getting our classes certified once CBP and the all those details are worked out. But we're looking forward to getting our classes certified under the new requirements for brokers. But I say certified; it's more accredited by them, by this group. So there's CBP picked 5 individuals or 5 organizations to accredit courses that are being offered that will be applied towards continuing education for brokers. And Marianne's group, the EMTC, and again, E-Merchants Trade Council, they were one of the groups that were selected as one of the accreditors, one of 5. Eventually, when they work through all the details and everything, we're going to have a panel of all 5 of them. Hopefully, they'll all come on. I don't think it's going to be a problem, but we'll try to have all 5 of them and talk about that. But congratulations on that, Marianne, because I know several people that have told me I applied and we didn't get in. It must have been a very rigorous screening process to get to that. And congratulations on that.
Thanks so much. And, I started E-Merchants Trade Council in 2021 and always wanted to do a certification program for trade professionals. And since I was last on the show, we actually did roll out our Global Trade Professional Certification Program, which is an ISO-based program for trade professionals. So we had built in that infrastructure. And so when the RFP came out from CBP, we were happy to apply because we already had the infrastructure in place. So being an accreditor for the LCB continuing education program is simply an extension of what we're already doing. But we'll be updating our website once CBP gives us further information to release, and we'll have all the information on our education page of our website.
Okay. Well, with that, let's get into talking about the recent moratorium on the digital traffic. We had an article in our weekly news roundup show that had come up where there was a moratorium that had been set a while back. The PSCG, I think, was part of that. That's the private sector consulting group. That is an advisor role to the WTO or the World Trade Organization. And with that, it basically had supported to put this moratorium down. Well, what's a moratorium on it for? It was to not tax digital or e-commerce type transactions. And we're talking literally the ability to generate revenue for governments, hence the tax, regarding, uploads and downloads of data, of sending. And, I'm doing my shopping. I want to, order up a widget. And so there's some of that. There's file transfers and things of that nature. Marianne, why don't you kind of explain a little bit more what, if I got it screwed up or whatever. I think that's
So the World Trade Organization started working on e-commerce, I think in 1995 or 1998. And at that time, they actually instituted a moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions. So that's the pure digital side of it. But if you remember back in 1998, that was really in the early stages of what we look upon as the digital economy. Right? We now have Netflix, or you can download games. Those are digital transmissions. Okay. But the World Trade Organization has since tried to negotiate a global framework for dealing with the cross-border movement of both physical and digital goods, but both goods and services. And that's what makes this framework unique. So they've been negotiating since 1998, but it really didn't gain steam until 2017. So in December of 2017, they started the negotiations with 71 members. So that meant that not all 198 or 200 countries were involved in the negotiations. And that's because the moratorium was on customs duties on digital transmissions was renewed every 2 years when the WTO had a ministerial. And in the last, I would say, decade, that vote has gotten closer and closer and tougher because countries like India, South Africa, and Indonesia, they feel that they're losing too much revenue on imposing customs duties on digital transmissions. So we always kind of knew that the last one, they had to actually stay an extra day in, I think it was Abu Dhabi is where they had it. They actually had to stay an extra day to get the moratorium extended for another 2 years. So that has put a fire under the negotiators to come out with an agreement. The problem with this agreement and what we what just happened July 26th was sort of the final, what they call the stabilized text has been released. In some ways, it's almost easier to talk about what's not in the agreement versus what is in the agreement. And so the big thing going to the moratorium, it only gives a moratorium on customs duties for 5 years after adoption or after the agreement goes into force. So it's not a permanent moratorium that many people expected. So it doesn't solve that problem. But they will study it, after that 5-year moratorium period. So that's problem number one.
Mm-hmm. Well, before you go on further, but I guess the incentive is like you mentioned it earlier that these governments feel like they're losing revenue. To me, I'm like, what do you mean feel like or whatever? They're thinking they are, but there is the use of digital transmissions of information would be the very thing to help stimulate trade between the countries, would it not?
Well, I remember when I was the private sector co-chair of the WCO e-commerce work group that came out with the framework of standards under the WCO, Indonesia made a presentation, and I think they said that they lost about $5 billion in revenue.
Based on what?
Not taxing. Now, there are some countries, it may be Indonesia, that actually do assess a value-added tax. Okay? Now, it depends on how countries generate most of their national revenue. And one of the things that I think we need to be sensitive to is the developed world, meaning the United States, Canada, Japan, Europe, those national governments derive most of their national revenue from income tax. The rest of the world derives most of their national revenue from customs duties and VAT. So they do know how much money that they are losing. The other part of it, Andy, is that the United States made a very fundamental policy decision back in the 1990s by not taxing internet companies, okay? The sales tax was the perfect example. That's since been reversed. And also Section 230, and I don't want to get into the Federal Communications Act, that they're not publishers. So our internet companies grew dramatically, but we have such an advantage against the rest of the world. So that's the geopolitics of it, and that we have such a big, dominant industry, e-commerce industry and digital industry compared to the rest of the world. And so as that disparity has grown, other countries' desire to tax has grown because they feel that they're really just taxing American companies.
Right. Well, and I do get that, where a lot of countries around the world are looking at it as any American companies are like the cash cow. So it's like, here we go. I get it. I understand that. I guess the industry as a whole then really should be looking at coming up with a particular solution or proposal on how to deal with that. And you're talking about people, negotiating it. Has the private sector offered any proposals that are worth merit?
Well, you have to remember that there are two sides to this coin. there is the direct tax side and the indirect tax side. And the World Trade Organization agreement that just was released really deals with the indirect tax side, the customs duties, the VAT side. The direct tax side is really through an OECD treaty. You may have heard of Pillar 2, where there would be a minimum global tax of 15%. And so that's how they're handling the direct tax side. Now, that's supposed to be a treaty. I don't even think the Biden administration has presented it to the Senate. But when I've been to a conference recently, and I went to sessions on this, the tax professionals are already changing the systems to comply with that Pillar 2, that 15% global minimum tax, even though it hasn't even been passed as a treaty in the United States yet. So these things are really in a state of flux, and it's the symbiotic relationship between both the direct tax side and the indirect tax side.
Well, and to your point, it's like, so the concept is, and I know that there's support for this through, even in the United Nations, there was in the UN, there was discussion supporting this kind of effort in different things. It's almost like this flat 15% tax on the transactions. But here's where a major heartburn of mine is on that. That's, you have that tax, but then you also have the VAT and the duties and everything else that are staying in place. They're not talking about replacing that. They're talking about adding that. So I'm like, not no, but hell no. That's screwball. So it's like, that's where I see some problems with this. Even in the smaller countries they still want to assess their local, duties and taxes, plus add all these other, flat taxes across. And we're not talking just digital now. We're talking about a flat tax on just about any kind of transaction. So that's where I guess I'm looking at it going, this is kind of screwball here. But to your point, people are moving forward with their agenda behind the scenes. So the bureaucrats are pushing it, and it hasn't become reality in anywhere that I know of.
Well, and what's happening is other countries, so Canada is a perfect example. The longer the United States waits, the more they're going to go back to imposing what they call digital services tax. Okay? So those are popping back up. And the OECD treaty was the compromise that we came up with. So I don't hear anybody really talking about the OECD treaty outside the tax preparers, field. So it's a concern, and I don't hear it on the campaign. Nobody's talking about it.
Okay. Well, this is getting way down in the weeds, if you will, on that particular thing. So let's pull back on this a little bit. And to that point, so as importers and exporters, whether you're a U.S. company, Canadian company, European company, any companies out there globally, especially a multinational company, this kind of effort, there are two questions here that you can comment. One, what do I need to do to get up to speed or proficient on this topic? Where can I get the information? And second, if I want to get somewhat active in this, do you have any recommendations on where or what trade associations or whatever to get involved to try and say, hey, here's our input?
Yeah. So AMTC, along with a number of other associations like the National Foreign Trade Council, the Computer Technology Association, ITIC, anybody who's in the technology field have done analyses, as I have done. And again, in this agreement, it's almost just as important of what's not in it as what is in it. Now, our association is different in the sense that our bylaws cover both cross-border movement of physical and digital goods. Okay. But also this agreement covers goods and services. So who should care about this agreement? If you are a global company at all, that does e-commerce, sales online. If you do any direct-to-consumer shipments, you should care about this. If you are a facilitator of cross-border goods, regardless of the size of the shipments, you really need to know about this agreement. And I would say that those companies that really have a global presence, you also need to know what countries are not a party to the agreement, because there's about 10 of them, including the United States, and India hasn't even participated in recent months. And, it's a big economy.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, with that, is there anything else you want to add on that before we start talking about de minimis?
Yes, very important. One of the problems that we had is several months ago, the United States Trade Representative announced that they were withdrawing support for 3 important digital trade policies that were really at the heart of this agreement, but also has been U.S. policy for about at least 10 years. That's the free flow of cross-border data flows, meaning you can just have data flows go across border without any restrictions, prohibiting national data localization requirements, and prohibiting the forced access to source code, which is really important for American companies where they have their trade secrets in the algorithms. Those 3 important trade policies are not in the agreement. And as a result, it's almost like taking the heart out of the digital side of this agreement. So that's really important for people to know. The other thing I would say is I have sort of a checklist of things that people should be aware of solely in the trade space. So one of those is e-invoicing. So the framework does work typically like a framework where it encourages. It doesn't make absolute requirements. So it talks about single window, but it also talks about e-invoicing. Again, in the United States, we don't see it as much, but Latin American countries and more countries are starting to opt for e-invoicing. What that means is that you issue an electronic invoice to the taxing authority. And more countries that have VAT are actually assessing VAT at that transactional level. So be aware of that. Again, the United States is the largest country that doesn't have a VAT, and we really don't have an e-invoicing system yet, but I would not be surprised if that's coming soon. And if you're doing business in Latin America and other countries, you've probably seen this already. The other issue I would take you should keep an eye on is both the privacy of data submitted to governments and transmitted, cross-border versus the what they call open government data. And the reason this matters for us is because of manifest data. So, for example, because of a court case, right, the United States does release ocean manifest data, and that's been used for a variety of purposes. There is a bill, I think it was Senator Cassidy introduced a bill that would actually require all modes of transportation, their manifest data to be released. And that's kind of proprietary data. You can find out a lot of information competitive-wise using that manifest data. So there is some tension between different provisions of this agreement. It seems to suggest that such data, should be released to the public for no charge. Okay. And then the other big thing that I would touch on is, the personal data protection. That's largely silent, and it leaves to the national governments to come up with a law protecting personal data. The United States, we do not have a national data privacy law. It's really the states have filled in there. And this has been a battle that's been waged for like 30 years. And so what has ended up happening to U.S. corporations that are global is we end up defaulting to the EU's GDPR, their global data privacy standard. So those are the highlights that I think people should be aware of.
Well, and all right. So to your point here, let's talk about this just a little bit though, is on this where the governments are going for taxing, some of these digital transactions. The only way for them to really do that is this idea of, privacy and all that. Well, guess what? The government is going to see and have access to all of your data that you transmit, either sending or receiving, all of it. And in this scenario, so stop and think. If you were in charge of setting up an infrastructure on what to charge, let's say it's a tax per data byte, per megabyte, per transaction, per whatever, you're going to have access to these data lines. And those data lines are going to be going. And so the first place that they're going to look at is any and all internet service providers. That's first and foremost. And then secondly is then if any by chance, locations that have companies that may be trying to transmit using completely their own network, which actually some of it goes through other, rented wires, if you will. When I say wires, rented networks. But all of those type of transactions, the government is going to put some kind of thing in the midst of that, if you will, so that the data is going to flow through a government entity box somehow, some way.
And in some ways, Andy, that's already set up under like ICANN. Each country has a national authority that governs the internet. Okay. And the assignment, ICANN does the assignment of URLs and things like that. But each country does have a national authority to do that. I think where people are going to see it first is I bet more and more countries are going to start assessing GST or VAT on, let's say, download of games, download of movies, and then the issue is if you're using a VPN and you can switch what country that your IP address, right? So it's going to be really interesting. And I think the other thing to talk about is when did this agreement go into effect? Well, typically what happens in WTO, and this is why this agreement is unique because it is not all the countries involved in the negotiations. There's about 91 involved in the negotiations, and only about 80 have indicated that they're going to adopt it. So typically, there is a little bit of a battle at the WTO whether all the members have to agree to an agreement, like the trade facilitation agreement, or can this be just a plurilateral agreement? And that's being hashed out now. But typically what happens is once about a majority of countries adopt it, which is usually around 110, 113 countries adopt it, it is considered an effect. Okay. So that's the number that we will kind of track and see how many countries adopt by depositing their instrument at the WTO. And obviously we'll monitor what the United States is going to do. And the reason that the United States didn't sign on to it is because I think the administration, at least this administration, wants to regulate artificial intelligence. And they're rethinking their policies.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's not been anything definitive that's come out. It's just that the U.S. is not supporting certain aspects of it, but it's where are you going, what are you doing, and all that. So anyway, we'll see. All right, so let's talk about de minimis. De minimis is one where there's been a lot of issues going on. The volume of de minimis shipments into the U.S. has just mushroomed. And a lot of folks have been looking at this deal where it moved from $200 and below to $800 and below and saying, okay, well, that's what's driving it. Everybody's getting away with it. Well, actually, the average value of de minimis shipments is still less than $60.
We use 50 actually. when we do
Yeah,
our
okay.
calculations.
So the raising of the de minimis up to $800 has had actually no effect. That's not where the issue is. The issue is that the volume of shipments coming in under the de minimis has mushroomed so much that let's look at it. You know, you have the post office or postal shipments that benefit from it, and the express carriers. I was part of the group that actually pushed for that, but those volumes are not where the mushrooming has come from. It is, you know, the e-commerce, if you will, the e-retailers and all that, where there's been a lot, and there's been a few, they're bringing over containers full of, and I'm talking ocean containers full of these de minimis shipments, and customs is overwhelmed by it. And there's some people, you know, struggling with that. And I mean, I have my opinion on some things, but there's a lot of talk about, well, what is coming in, and there's some bad stuff coming in, or there are people not adhering to certain things. So what's the latest on some of the regulations that are going down this road here?
So I would say there are 4 major bills, and I'll just go through them really quick. The House of Representatives actually has passed a bill in China's De Minimis Abuse Act. It's H.R. 7979. So that passed the House of Representatives, and it has a number of provisions, part of a package. And it basically restricts the use of de minimis. So if you have an item that would be subject to Section 301, Section 201, you know, and other additional duties, that would be ineligible. It does have a few additional data requirements that the government would collect. So that's passed the House. Now, that legislation is pending in the Senate before the Senate Finance Committee. And so just recently, last week, Senator Wyden, who is chair of the Senate Finance Committee, came out with his bill called Fighting Illicit Goods, Helping Trustworthy Importers and Netting Gains for America Act of 2024. They're coming up with such absurd names. So this is called the Fighting for America Act. And that was just introduced. So it does, like H.R. 7979, it restricts certain types of articles, import-sensitive goods, items subject to anti-dumping countervailing duties, subject to special tariff investigations under 21301 and 232. The bill also requires the 10-digit harmonized tariff schedule number and the country of origin. It also increases penalties for violations. The first offense is $5,000. The second offense or subsequent violation is $10,000. But then it brings you very quickly into a fraud scenario. The other thing that's unique about the Senate bill compared to the House bill is it charges $2 per shipment fee. Okay, so every de minimis shipment would be subject to a $2 fee. And I would say that the reason this is ramped up is because, as you stated, you know, the increase in de minimis, if you look at those numbers on the CBP website, what really happened that we didn't anticipate was the pandemic, because the e-commerce supply chain was the only thing that really kind of withstood the pandemic. But also the Section 301 duties imposed on Chinese goods. And those kind of conflated at the same time. But I think Congress has been very concerned about this area, primarily because of Temu and Shein. Now, the House Committee on the CCP did a report, and the chairman at the time, Mike Gallagher, sent letters to Shein and Temu. He came out with a statistic indicating that 60% or 66% of the shipments coming in on de minimis are Shein and Temu. I don't know how he could come up with that number unless they really analyzed the data. And I'm not so sure CBP has that data, but that's what they indicated. So I think they're trying to craft these bills in a way that deals with those issues, deals with those companies. The original bill that sort of kicked off thinking about de minimis is Errol Blumenauer's bill. Errol Blumenauer is chairman of the Trade Subcommittee of House Ways and Means, and he's from Oregon. And he introduced it last Congress, reintroduced it again this Congress. His bill would use a criteria for countries that were ineligible. So it would be if you're on the Special 301 list, you violate IPR, things like that. And the only country that satisfies all that criteria is China. So his bill would really basically block all de minimis shipments from China. And then there is a third bill, which is kind of interesting, from Senator Cassidy, co-sponsored by Senator Baldwin, but also Senator J.D. Vance, who's our vice presidential candidate for the Republicans. His is called the De Minimis Reciprocity Act. And this would direct the Secretary of Treasury to establish the de minimis of goods coming into the country based on the de minimis threshold of that other country. And the problem with this is it would be very hard for CBP, I think, to administer just to code that into the ACE system. And it also would include any other threshold, including VAT. Okay. So if you charged a country card for VAT, that would be taken into consideration. The other thing that makes it interesting is that it would establish a reshoring and nearshoring account. So any revenue equivalent to what they would collect for de minimis would be used into a reshoring and nearshoring account to bring businesses back from China. China and Russia are excluded, and they have some other criteria, but they also have additional data requirements that are not as explicit or as refined as Senator Wyden's bill.
Well, let me stop for a second. From a reciprocal agreement scenario here on the de minimis, I will say, in my personal opinion, is that could be set up in a sense pretty easily to say, basically, in some of these countries, they're only offering, $50 or $40 or even $20 in some cases. Like, okay, you're coming into ours, it's going to be, we'll lower it down to that. Because here's where I take the stance. All these countries, all these companies around the world want access to the U.S. market. Why? Well, we're the largest economy in the world. It's massive and all that. And I don't have a problem with that. But when U.S. goods are not treated fairly abroad. And so when the U.S. is wanting to compete or go in and send their goods to other countries, there's all kinds of barriers that seem to be put up, especially for U.S. products. And you've traveled around the world. I've traveled around the world. I've seen it firsthand. And as I'm looking at this going, well, now wait a minute. We want fair trade. Everybody talks about free trade. Free trade means your market is free, to get into it, as well as trying to make it a duty-free type scenario is the context. But the free trade is more of like, hey, you have access to my market. I have access to yours. And in reality, what happens and has happened for decades is, again, people are the U.S.'s economy is consumed so much. But the one thing is that we are sacrificing goods that are imported at the cost of U.S. jobs for exports. U.S. exports are down because we don't it makes it so difficult. So I would say on that realm, we're not even talking about duties, for example. We're just talking about the de minimis going back and forth. So I see great opportunity there.
On the one hand, I'm dealing with customs and other agencies on the import side, but I'm also talking to the Department of Commerce because the European Union, as part of its customs reform package, is eliminating de minimis, customs duties de minimis for low value shipments for e-commerce. Now they had eliminated their de minimis for VAT several years ago. And what they had to do was create what's called these importer one-stop shops, where you register with one company for your tax ID, and they will, remit the VAT to the country that the shipment is going to. They have a 150 euro de minimis now, but that will be gone by, I think, May of 2028, I think is the implementation date. So we've talked to the European Union about this. We've sent a letter. We're also dealing with the International Affairs Office of U.S. Department of Commerce and saying this is a real problem if they eliminate, de minimis for U.S. exports. And one of the issues I have is the U.S., the way it collects data, the electronic export information only kicks in at the value of $2,500 or above. So we're only estimating what those low value shipments are for shipments below that $2,500 threshold. So it's a real problem, and the government is aware of it.
Yeah, well, to your point, and here's, I guess, where I'm going is that all these governments keep looking at it, and de minimis means that it is a value so low, it's not worth going through an entry process. Why? Because the cost for processing an entry, preparing it and transmitting it on the importer's part, as well as the government's part to process that, is such that you're going to offset any revenue that you generate from it. So here's the thing that I guess I look at in that as we go through that is that there are all these governments looking at, and folks, you need to understand this when you're looking and talking about this. Oh, well, we're losing all this revenue. Well, stop a minute. What is the cost? You got to look at it holistically. What is the cost of processing that from an entry perspective? We're not talking physical clearance. From an entry perspective to collect that revenue. And quite frankly, every time it's looked at, all right, you're going to get, let's say $2 in revenue for a shipment, but it costs you $3, $4, or $5 to process it on the government side. So it's like they eliminate this stuff. It's like they're cutting their nose off to spite their face, in that it's like you're going through this, you're going to eliminate it. We're going to crack down and look at all this revenue we're going to be able to collect, but then it's going to cost you in the long run more money. That's one thing.
And that's why we submitted comments to Congress saying, before you make any change to de minimis, have the General Accountability Office that reports directly to Congress conduct a study with CBP as to what the cost is to process an entry and how many additional full-time staffers, CBP officers, they would need, if you adjusted de minimis or restricted its use.
Remember, yes, all right, you're transmitting electronic data, so it's more cost effective in today's world. Yes. And your system would set flags to say what could go through and what doesn't. Here's the ones we need to look at. You've got to have, and you just hit it. What's the staffing that customs would need, whether it's in the U.S. or anywhere else, to look at an on-screen review of the information and then go from there to say, okay, I'm going to examine it. I need to select it. All those kinds of things that come into play. Now, I'm a big proponent of there needs to be a surcharge, if you will, $2 per shipment you mentioned earlier, for processing the de minimis. I'm a big supporter of it, provided that $2 goes to customs, not in the general fund, so that there is staffing and their own facilities and equipment are paid for. That's one thing. The second thing is, any and all of these locations that are processing de minimis, it could be a truckload, it could be a rail car load, it could be an ocean container, it could be, air cargo, whatever, that there needs to be facilities and systems set up so that every shipment comes through and electronically is accounted for. And then it's like, oh, you know what? That's a flag for inspection, and they can pull it out. The justification right now is a container comes in from the ocean, 20-footer, 40-footer, and customs wants to look at some specific shipments in there. Oh, well, I don't have anywhere, we're going to have to take this into the warehouse. We're going to have to unload all that. And you know what? That's the problem of the carrier and the people that are importing that. Doggone it. It's like you need to have the facilities. You want to use the de minimis value and use that and sell to the market, then this is what it takes to handle it. The express carriers all have to do that, and they're charged reimbursables, as it's called, and they have to pay for the facilities and all that. To me, if you're going to utilize that same process, then you need to step up and have the facilities, pay the surcharges, and make sure that customs and the other agencies then are staffed. The only way to do that is through what I was just thinking, that $2 per shipment or whatever it is appropriate.
We have proposed to CBP to conduct a pilot program that's fairly unusual. And that's to flip this on its head, to come up with a risk management model. And the way to do that pilot is to work with the U.S. Postal Service to get a risk profile on U.S. e-sellers who are exporting. And that way we can gather data, but also entice other countries to do risk profiles on their e-sellers in their jurisdiction. Because the problem that we have is we don't have a traditional importer of record. Okay. So CBP and other customs administrations don't have a risk model that scales for the number of e-sellers and the volume of shipments in the e-commerce space. And that's why we thought if we did something unorthodox in the United States, using the Postal Service to gather data on our exporters, we can then show what's possible to other countries as an enticement of exchanging data on those risk profiles. We really haven't gotten response from CBP, but they're really behind the 8 ball. And the final thing I want to mention, just so people are aware of this, there is a proposed rule on low value shipments winding its way through the Office of Management and Budget. It's at the last interagency process discussion. Our association, National Foreign Trade Council, EAA, and a number of associations submitted requests and got meetings with the interagency group. And it's very strange because we can only present arguments. They may ask for clarification, but it's not really a dialogue. So there is a proposed regulation that may be coming out. And so we had our meeting probably a month ago now. And it's very strange because we know that they have conducted pilots, right? The 321 pilot, the Type 86. Under this proposed rule, Type 86 would go away, Type 86 entry. And so we really don't know what's in the proposed regulation. So, and we don't know what the final policy choice and policy recommendation. Treasury is on that interagency, CBP, USTR, but Small Business Administration is not. And that's a difference from when we dealt with this in the latter days of the Trump administration, because I think SBA was far more sensitive to the impact that this will have on small business. So we're waiting to see if that shoe drops as well.
Okay, we've talked about a whole heck of a lot. Again, on this particular issue, then obviously your association is very involved on the e-commerce front. Surprise, surprise, since it's focused on e-commerce. But with that, what is your website so that folks can, if they're interested?
Just go to emtc.org.
emtc.org. Folks, I'm going to tell you, that is one thing is that if you are doing, you may not be a full-fledged e-seller. It may be a side deal for your company. That's fine. It's still, you're involved. If you're taking orders electronically, you're submitting them electronically to your distribution centers and all of that. All of that comes into play, and that's e-commerce. Guess what? So you need to get involved with it. To stay up to speed, the ET, or if I got it, e-commerce, EC, what is it?
emtc.org.
EMTC. Oh, God, I'll tell you what, my memory's as long as a turtle's tail. EMCTC, whatever it is. Okay. We'll have the connect, folks. We'll have the connection or contact information in the show notes. But reach out, get up to speed on this because it affects more than just e-retailers. It's big companies, small companies, all that kind of stuff. With what we've talked about, the digital taxing to the de minimis, if you're utilizing that, there's opportunity also on. To me, I see it. Whether it's some people think it's good or not, it need to look at that last bill you talked about is a reciprocal agreement with other countries regarding the de minimis value. That has some phenomenal potential for U.S. companies. Again, we've had a lot of people hitting the U.S. It's like, hey, if you want to generate some sales in other markets, I think it's fair. We still have to compete on price to the end consumer, cycle times, and quality and all that. So to me, hey, let's just play on the same rules. If we're giving you 800, you give us 800 or whatever it may be. So, Marianne, thank you so much for joining our show. Once again, we've gotten into some really good, deep stuff. So this is not one of those feel-good shows. This is a very detailed learning show.
And it requires real input from the trade community because e-commerce is a growing percentage of global trade. I think it's up to 20% now. So it's getting there.
It's huge. Thank you so much. We appreciate you. Lalo, any last comments from your end?
No, let's just thank you all for joining us and looking forward to getting some more feedback. If you have any comments on LinkedIn whenever we post this episode on our YouTube channel. Thank you so much.
If you've got any issues on de minimis and you want to add some input to it, please reach out to us because I'd love to engage in more discussion on it as we try and understand what's going on and what we should do about it. With all of that, folks, again, please hit the follow button, subscribe button, like us, share us, and all that. And we hope you have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us. SimplyTrade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show or would like to sponsor SimplyTrade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com or you can DM us on Twitter at SimplyTradePod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. SimplyTrade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by SimplyTrade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.